Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for being with us. Today, I'm joined by Victoria Rose, who is our typical host, but also happens to lead our coverage of ballot measures here at Ballotpedia. Her team has been hard at work these last couple of months on a historical ballot measures project, which we're really excited to hear more about today. And specifically, we'll be talking about Texas. Victoria, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Frank. I'm excited to be on the other side of things this time.
Yeah, just initial reaction, what's it like to be the one answering the questions versus the one asking them?
Since this is my wheelhouse, I definitely feel a little less pressure. A lot of my other interviews, I'm new to these topics, learning just like our listeners. So it's fun to be on the other side.
Yeah, I was going to say, anytime that we have you talking about ballot measures with, one of our the other members of your team, I'm always really excited to hear you guys nerd out and talk about what you know best and are most interested in. So excited to learn all about Texas today.
Yeah, definitely a nerdy conversation.
So big picture wise, Victoria, what is the Historical Ballot Measures Project? What is that?
Yeah, so Ballotpedia is in the process of developing what we're calling a historic ballot measure fact book, which will document nearly 200 years of direct democracy in the United States for statewide ballot measures. And this is an ongoing research project. It's going to take years. It started years before I even was on the team. But so far, we've completed full inventory of statewide ballot measures in Arizona, California, Colorado, Delaware, Michigan, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and now Texas.
Wow. Yeah, that list is growing fast. I actually didn't know that the project had been going on for years now. So really cool to learn that it's starting to make some real headway. Wanted to ask, obviously, as our listeners may not know, you live in Texas and you've led a lot of this work yourself. What was that like? Did you feel like you knew a lot of the history already coming into this work, or was it kind of like a big learning experience for you?
Well, since I am a Texas transplant, not a native, I did not have all the history until I started covering Texas in 2019. And then I worked on the historical ballot measure project specifically in Texas this past year. So definitely a little bit of a learning curve for me as well.
So I feel like being a Texas transplant is probably pretty similar to being like a New York City transplant. And you can't ever really claim, it takes you a long time at least to really claim like you're a true Texan or a true New York City member, right?
Yeah, for sure. After 4 years, I finally got my cowboy boots. So
nice. And not from Boot Barn, I'm sure, from some place, a real outfitter.
Yeah, Tecovas. There's a little plug for Tecovas.
I don't even know what that is. So that's the Northeast for you up here. Let's start big picture if we can, Victoria. When it comes to Texas, how many ballot measures did you find actually?
Yeah, so we tracked 708 ballot measures from 1879 to the latest in 2023. Texas has had 5 state constitutions during its statehood, with the most recent one adopted in 1876. So we only tracked amendments to the current state constitution.
Okay, and then as you said a couple beats back when you started our conversation in the host chair, you're kind of learning a lot of this stuff for the first time, which is my experience a lot of time on the show. I actually never knew that there were multiple constitutions in Texas. That's a pretty cool fact there to learn. But were there any years where you saw that activity was spiked, or has it been pretty consistent across the last 140 years or so?
Yeah, there have definitely been some ebbs and flows in the amount of ballot measures that Texan voters see on their ballot. On the landing page for this project, our readers can find a bar graph that shows the number of measures approved and defeated by decade. And the decade with the most was actually the 1980s, which saw a total of 108 measures, of which 91 were approved. So that's kind of a high approval rating. But the average number of measures per decade was 44. So the 1980s is definitely an outlier.
Nice. And then just off the top of your head, do you recall this last decade from 2010 to 2020? Do you remember, was that kind of close to the historical average, or was it a little bit of an outlier as well?
I cannot off the top of my head remember if the 2010s to 2020s was close to the average. I know last year in 2023, we actually saw a record for the past 20 years number of ballot measures, which was 14. So I bet we'll be above the average in this decade.
Very cool. And 708 seems like a ton of ballot measures. If people really want to dig into the nitty gritty and read every single one of them, they could. Maybe you got a big project going on at school, or you're just really invested in learning about how the process works down in Texas. But across that time frame, what were the most common topics Texas citizens have tried to address via ballot measure in their history?
Yeah, so in total, Texas ballot measures have addressed 69 unique topics, with some addressing multiple topics in their text. The top three topics that we identified were taxes, with 130 measures addressing that topic. County and municipal government was the next one with 79 measures, and then administration of government with 78 measures. So not the most exciting topics that we see when it comes to our ballot measure coverage, but that kind of goes into a little bit of our conversation later that we'll get into.
Yeah, I was going to say that all those do seem to have like don't mess with Texas vibes though too a little bit, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It's like the overarching umbrella category. Some of it I think is always really interesting to learn about states and how ballot measures work, whenever we're talking about it. It's just that the processes are really different from state to state and sometimes even county to county, if I have that right. So when we're talking about the process in Texas, what does that look like?
Yeah, so in Texas, we are one of the 24 states that do not have a citizen initiative process. So the only way ballot measures end up on the ballot is through a 2/3 vote of each chamber of the state legislature. But like you said, county to county, Texas does allow local citizen initiatives. So Texans might see on their local ballots initiatives put on the ballot by local citizens. So since in Texas, ballot measures only refer to the ballot by the state legislature, they're constitutional amendments. Texans did have the opportunity to adopt the initiative process during the time period that most other states did in 1914, but the constitutional amendment was actually defeated with 51% of voters opposing it.
51% seems really narrow, right? That's just like a very small majority preventing that from happening. Like you said, at a moment in time when a lot of other states were doing that. Did they revisit efforts to try to get that back into the process or
It was never put on the ballot after 1914.
That's kind of surprising. Constitutional amendments, like you mentioned, being the primary way in which, ballot measures happen in the state of Texas. Does that have any notable impact on the types of measures that get proposed? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it definitely can. Texans don't see other topics at the ballot box that the state legislature can just enact via law, like state statute. Texans also don't see common topics of citizen initiative, like minimum wage, marijuana, or more recently, like abortion.
When we're looking at any aspect of our political system these days, right, we got to talk about it in terms of parties. And I'm sure that there is some really interesting party history when it comes to which party might have been using ballot measures more in Texas history and maybe the different ways in which they were doing so. Was there a clear divide in your research that you noticed?
I guess let's get into the process a little bit, and that'll help explain the partisanship.
Sure.
So the threshold to put an amendment on the ballot in Texas is a 2/3 supermajority vote. So it's kind of a high threshold. So you need 21 votes in the Senate and 100 votes in the House. So legislative majorities definitely matter to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot. In our research, we found that Democrats controlled the state legislature from at least 1879, when the first amendment was on the ballot, until 1997, when Republicans gained control of the state Senate. And then it was a divided legislature until 2003, when Republicans gained control of both chambers, which they still hold today. So because of their long tenure during the 20th century, Democrat-controlled legislatures placed 532 of the 708 measures on the ballot, whereas Republicans holding office or holding control of the legislature for a shorter period only referred 124 to the ballot. And then the rest were put on the ballot when the legislature was divided. During its 2023 session, Texas meets in odd years, if our listeners didn't know that. So we usually see odd year ballot measures. Republicans held 19 seats and then in the Senate, and then 86 seats in the House. So not enough for a 2/3 majority. So any of the amendments that were on the ballot received some sort of bipartisan support to get on the ballot.
That's really cool. And I feel like it's not necessarily, when you look at a state like Texas, right, that historically has been dominated for most of its history, right, by one party versus another. It's not about one party being more activist than another. It's just kind of a function of, when one party's in control, the other party tends to be the one that utilizes ballot measures more. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say it just depends on the agenda of the party at the time.
With ballot measures, the success rate is everything, right? If they don't pass, proponents have to go back to the drawing board and either pursue different issues or figure out a new way to get what they're advocating for approved. So what's the success rate look like in Texas?
Right. So of those 708 measures, 528 were approved and 180 were defeated. And from our data, we determined that the average yes vote for those 100 or 708 measures was 59.3% of a yes vote. So pretty high success rate.
Yeah, I was going to say that seems pretty high. How does that compare nationally? Is that pretty standard, or is that a cut above or maybe a little bit below what we see?
Yeah, I think it's hard to compare, like you said, because each state is so different. There's only a handful or like a certain segment of states that just have constitutional amendments, which often tend to be less controversial than states with citizen initiatives, which have probably a lower success rate.
Nice, that checks out. As I mentioned at the top of our conversation, Victoria, all 708 of these ballot measures can be found online. If people really want to get into the weeds, they can find those links in our show notes. But when you were looking through all of these, I would love to hear, maybe a close, what kind of stuck out to you? What were some of the most notable topics tackled across Texas history, or was there anything that was particularly interesting?
Yeah, there were a few that kind of stuck out to me. That initiative and referendum amendment was definitely interesting. And then a couple others were 2 amendments that would have enacted a statewide prohibition in 1887 and 1911 were both defeated, but it was ultimately passed in 1919. And then another topic that Texas might be more known for today in recent history is not having a state income tax, which is in the state constitution. That was first adopted in 1993, where Texans approved Proposition 4 with 69% of the vote, prohibiting a state personal income tax without voter approval. And if they were ever to approve an income tax, that revenue would have to be dedicated to education spending. And then that was reaffirmed in 2019 with another Proposition 4, which added to the state constitution just an outright prohibition on levying a state income tax on individuals. And that was approved with a greater majority with 74% of the vote.
Super cool. And I think, listeners, if you look through and you're like Victoria and a couple stick out to you as your favorites, leave us a message on Twitter or any of our other social medias. We'd love to hear about it. But I know you mentioned way earlier, Victoria, that our end goal is to get every state here covered. I know the project has already been going on for a couple of years, so I won't ask you to try to project when we might be done rounding up all 50 states. But any clue what states might be on the horizon? Do we have any sort of sneak peeks that we can give people, or is that kind of a wait and see?
Yeah, we're currently finishing up North Carolina, which is kind of proven to be a little bit of a challenge. This whole project is somewhat of a challenge depending on historical resources that are available online. So yeah, our hope is to have every state accounted for, but it definitely depends on the resources that we can find to verify all this information.
Cool. Well, keep us posted. We're going to be excited to hear more whenever you guys have more states for us to check out. Victoria, great to have you as our guest. I would love to have you back on the show sometime soon. So thank you again for coming by.
Yeah, thanks, Frank.
And for our listeners, you can learn more about Texas historical ballot measures at the link in our bio. We'll be back soon with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thank you for listening. We'll see you soon.